Welcome to the Investor Coaching Show, a podcast to help you get an insider's view of the financial world and escape common investment traps. We look at the financial news of the day and help you make sense of it so you can relax about money.
I'm Evan Barnard. Hope you're enjoying this gorgeous day outside. If it's back down to 20 degrees when you hear the podcast, I'm very sorry that you didn't hear this live and it's not still 80 degrees outside and gorgeous. So, shifting from the war and being relaxed about money, here is an area where you really do want to pay attention and put some safeguards up there for yourself. An article from the journal, How to Protect Yourself from Financial Scams Targeting Older Adults. Americans over 60 are losing billions of dollars to fraud, a far bigger threat than physical crime. This is an article by Claire Ansberry in the journal. Physical crimes against older adults are rare. Financial crimes aren't. While the abduction of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of news anchor Savannah Guthrie, made many older people feel vulnerable, a far bigger threat is having someone wipe out your savings. Scammers will, of course, try to scam anyone regardless of age, but older adults are prime targets because they often have accumulated wealth and live alone and are assumed to be vulnerable. More than 147,000 people 60 and older reported scams in 2024 with losses of $4.9 billion. That is a lot of money, folks. And both of those numbers, the 147,000 and the $5 billion, were up more than 40% from the year earlier, according to the FBI. What makes matters worse, and just like, frankly, securities crimes, the majority of frauds aren't reported because of shame and fear, making the actual numbers far higher. Julie Schoen, past director of the National Center on Elder Abuse, says there's not a family out there who has not or will not encounter some form of financial abuse. And, when I was first reading this article, I started thinking about, has my dad been involved in anything? Has his wife been involved in anything? None that I know of. I certainly know clients that have had issues with this, not always scams, just could be ID theft and things like that. But it can be a real problem. Sitting on a plane, a fellow traveler told her about his father, a nuclear physicist, who was scammed out of more than $100,000 in an investment fraud that promised high returns and low risk. So frankly, whether it's in person, whether it's internet, whether it's phone, whatever, email, if you get some message that promises high returns and low risk, bells and whistles ought to go off. Call your kids, call your attorney, call your financial advisor, but don't just say, wow, I found this high return, no risk investment. Investors aren't stupid. If you're going to get a higher return, there is risk that is going to accompany that. That's just the math of the deal. The father kept meticulous records, which helped the FBI track down the scammer, but the father still lost most of his money. After a scam is exposed, many victims beat themselves up. And I've experienced this in conversations with people over the years. They just feel foolish. They feel sheepish, like, oh, I should have known better. And the bottom line is you are a victim. So don't beat yourself up and say, oh, it's just my fault. There was a crime involved. But you do have to prepare yourself so that you don't get taken advantage of. She had received an email asking whether she authorized a $900 purchase on her PayPal debit card. It directed her to call the number provided if she hadn't. I should have known better, picked up my debit card and called the number listed there. Instead, I should have known better, picked up my debit card, there we go, and called the number listed on the back of her debit card. Instead, she called the number in the email. Let me touch on this briefly. because we just had our monthly meeting of all of the team members here at Paul Winkler Inc. and did a deep dive into how we can be prepared to deal with the increasing use of deep fakes. We could get an inbound phone call that sounds like one of our clients because of voice cloning. We've even seen YouTube or, like Zoom videos of video clones, and it looks like you might be talking to someone or talking to your boss, and they're asking you to, release funds or something like that. Certainly emails, voicemails, email can get hacked. And so it is becoming an issue that, we're on top of, but, you don't want to make it's one of those areas where you can't really afford to make a mistake. I can eat a donut and it's not going to totally throw off my game plan. If somebody, clones a voice and we send out some money to the wrong person, that's a real problem. I should have known better, she says. Instead, she called the number on the email. David White answered, saying he worked in the PayPal legal department and that a criminal ring in Texas had obtained her personal information, including Social Security number, and had access to her retirement account. Here's where it gets scary and frustrating for me. He advised her to transfer her money into another account, which he said had federal protection. Over several days, White guided her as she cashed out her stocks, bonds, and CDs, despite warnings from her bank and her financial advisor. So let me pause there. She even, I guess probably the bank officer or advisor called and was like, what are you doing? Because we have to actually be aware of if there's senior abuse, elder abuse going on. Is it a kid that just wants their money sooner than waiting to get it through the will or a beneficiary designation? And so they were clearly checking up on her, and she ignored both of their warnings and just kept doing it. And ultimately, as directed, she put the cash in boxes and gave them to couriers who came to her apartment. When the last delivery was made, she called White. The number was disconnected. That was when the enormity of what she had lost hit her. Here's the sad thing. Impersonators like White are common. Scammers will pose as grandchildren, police officers, bank staff, and Medicare employees. In some cases, they use AI to clone voices. So that's the bad news, and that's just a really sad story about that. So how do you protect yourself? Well, number one is just set some boundaries. You can set limits on financial transfers within your banks, brokerage, and other firms. Direct all unknown callers to voicemail. That's largely something I think I do already. I don't know. RJ, do you pick up numbers that you don't recognize on your phone, or do you just let it go to voicemail?
I don't know. Depends if it says like it's scam likely or not.
Yeah, okay.
If I recognize the area code, I'll probably pick it up.
Okay, got it. Now, thinking about scam likely, I bet every day, I think twice a day, morning and evening, I get a call from the 202 area code, which is Washington, D.C. And it always says scam likely, which I think is just some poetic justice right there. But if it's an unknown caller and you're worried about being particularly vulnerable to financial, scamming, just let it go to voicemail. You want to prevent that. You can set up some limits on your bank, like, have some instructions that you won't let a transaction over $500 go out without, my knowledge or some other positive confirmation, just so if you lose your ID, even if you didn't get scammed, that a hacker can't necessarily get all that out because you've got that safeguard. Obviously, you don't want to click on links. If you get a phone call or you see a phone number written on a letter like this lady had received, use a separate source that's independent to verify the phone number. I think Dr. Friday has said this numerous times over the years. The IRS doesn't call you to say, hey, you owe us money, or anything like that. They send letters. I think they keep the post office in business. But, if you get a phone call or something, verify the number from some independent means. Go to the internet, open your bank statement and just call their fraud number, their online banking number before you just give out your information. So set boundaries, stop and think. One of the most effective anti-scam strategies is to resist the urge to act quickly, which can be one of the scammer's most effective tools. Pressure to act before something bad happens can cause people to shut down further critical thinking. Slow down. There's no harm in hanging up and calling a number you verify for yourself. Anyone can make a poor decision, especially under duress. Diana Jackson's mom, a widow in her 80s, got a call from someone claiming to be investigating fraud at her bank and needed account information. Her mom provided it, but then realized she shouldn't have. She told the caller she needed to talk to her daughter, who handles her finances, and hung up. Her daughter was on the plane when this happened, and she ended up calling the bank as soon as she landed. By the time her plane had landed, the scammers had already transferred $10,000 from her mom's accounts to her credit card, and they were in the process of making other charges when the bank closed the account. And take action. If it happens, quickly reporting the fraud to police can sometimes stop a scam before money is lost. They can't investigate something they're not aware of. Roger Loeffler, a widower in his 90s, checked his account balances daily and noticed they were lower than expected. He called his son, Keith, who arrived shortly after. Police were called. Keith suspects his dad, who lived in a continuing care community, threw away a voided check that had banking and routing numbers. A man who was later arrested on forgery charges created and cashed 3 phony checks using his dad's account information. By then, though, the bank had stopped payment on his dad's checking account, so the senior didn't lose any money. I always worried about him clicking on the wrong thing, says Keith, whose dad has since passed away. I never worried about checks in a garbage can. And so, it's not always going to be electronic fraud or anything like that. And how widespread is this going to be? Why do we have, why am I spending some time on this? Frankly, if you're relaxed about money and your portfolio is being rebalanced and it's properly diversified and you accumulate $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million and then get scammed out of $1 million or even scammed out of $100,000, that hurts just as much, if not worse, than any market volatility. And so I just want to make sure you're protected around this. But it's becoming a huge business. Bloomberg had an article on how Southeast Asia became home to the world's scam farms. And there's a picture on this article. At some point, maybe we'll see if we can get on the YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, or whatever for the Investor Coaching Show. But it looks like a college dormitory, or even just one of the apartment buildings around the station or down in Franklin. But it looks like a housing project. But it's got barbed wire around it and an armed guard, and it's basically a call center in Cambodia where these people live and run scams. Online scammers steal billions of dollars each year, targeting anyone they can reach on a mobile phone or computer. This is reading from the article in Bloomberg. Governments have watched with alarm as large-scale operations known as scam farms, physical hubs where fraud operations are run using trafficked workers, have multiplied in recent years, particularly in Southeast Asia. Now, this was interesting. I hadn't really thought about this. The industry was turbocharged by the COVID-19 pandemic and, frankly, a military coup in Myanmar, helping turn the region into a global epicenter of online fraud. The schemes are becoming more sophisticated as gangs harness artificial intelligence tools and increasingly overlap with other forms of transnational crime. And so it goes on to kind of describe the scam farms, and just it could be a single floor in an office. It could also be an entire facility complete with dorms and so forth. Now, here's an interesting piece that I just hadn't thought about. I was recently at a conference, and we had a presentation from an organization called Atlas Free, which gets, frankly, men and women out of sex trafficking, frankly, all over the world, and fighting human trafficking in general. It's an organization we actually support as a firm, but this was really interesting. Workers from nearly 70 countries have been trafficked into these compounds, often lured by ads for legitimate jobs. On arrival, many have their passports confiscated and are confined inside, forced to work 15-hour days under threat of fines and abuse, including starvation, beatings, and electric shocks. So if you have someone on the other end of the computer or the phone and that's what they're facing, they're going to sound as convincing as humanly possible in order to get that scam to work. And so some of these scam farms, it's as much involved with human trafficking as sex trafficking of people, which is crazy. And it's hard to dismantle this because they're in countries where corruption tends to flourish, where leadership changes hands. It's a very mobile thing. It's not like, it's not like moving a manufacturing facility. You just move people to another building, set up their phone, and they get going. And so, it's a huge problem. The U.S. Institute of Peace, I didn't even know we had a U.S. Institute of Peace, report estimated that transnational criminal networks running online gambling and scam operations stole nearly $64 billion globally in 2023. Americans alone lost about $5 billion to online scams. And so, they go on to talk about technology is making it harder and harder, duplicating voices and so forth. And so just, again, buyer beware. Make sure you don't make any quick decisions. If something happens, report it quickly. I bet every 3 or 4 months I get a phone call from a client that, hey, we got hacked or I lost a credit card. Can you put a security notice on our accounts, so that no one can trade criminally. And, so there are safeguards that you can put in place. But just be aware, and forewarned is forearmed, as we say. You're listening to the Investor Coaching Show. We'll be right back after this on Super Talk 99.7.
Hey, just a note to you podcast folks, we just came out with a retirement income guide, and I'm super excited about this. There are all kinds of myths about taking income in retirement. People worry about running out of money, and rightfully so, because a lot of these myths can actually cause that. Now, the myths that you typically hear about, number one, dividends, living off dividends in retirement. Real estate, life insurance as a retirement investment, and annuities and interest-bearing accounts and target date funds. There are all kinds of things out there. What I want to do is put something together that walks through why those things are problematic, number one. Number two, the other thing that I wanted to do is walk through the evidence-based research on taking income in retirement. And we got a ton of data going all the way back to 1900. Hey, what's the logic behind it? And it's intensely logical. So we put that together, and all you have to do to download that, making it super simple, just go to paulwinkler.com/relax, and you can actually get into that very easily right there. So I would urge you to do that. Check it out, because I think you're going to really like it. paulwinkler.com/relax.
We were talking about scams, and here's an interesting article. I don't tend to see a lot of these conversations, but a Democratic lawmaker questions if FINRA should be folded into SEC. FINRA is the financial industry, something regulatory authority. I can't remember what the N is. I've been out of FINRA. Yeah, it's just financial industry regulatory authority. And it is what's called a self-regulating organization, SRO. And so here's the deal, is the longstanding question of whether Wall Street's primary brokerage regulator should even exist in its current form surfaced during a House hearing yesterday as lawmakers debated whether the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority should ultimately be folded into the Securities and Exchange Commission. Representative Brad Sherman, the top Democrat on the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets, said the fundamental policy question before Congress is whether regulation of brokerage firms should remain in the hands of a private, self-regulatory organization such as FINRA or be brought fully inside government. So let me compare this. What would it be like the people supervising organized crime are ones that have a, check kiting scheme or something like that. You wouldn't have the criminals supervising the criminals, or there's a lot of things that are going to go away. Am I saying that all the securities companies are criminals? No, that's not what I'm saying. But it's an enormous conflict of interest if the industry is regulating itself. Those things don't tend to turn out very well. The policy issue before us is whether the SRO should be folded into the SEC, Sherman said. I'm a very faithful agnostic on that issue. I simply don't know. So here's a little bit of background. A lot of times if you open a brokerage account, and frankly, sometimes we have an arbitration clause as well, but FINRA handles the arbitration process. And if you have a regular traditional brokerage account, you can't sue the brokerage with some rare exceptions. So I don't like to use the term never where there's a legal term involved, but it's really hard to do. Most of the time, those issues are settled by arbitration. But in arbitration, you're going to a panel, and members of that panel can be inside of the securities industry, and there should be members that were not inside the securities industry, but you can bet that they have a very good idea of what should be going on. Here's the problem. Those people are independent contractors, and, we always give Congress a hard time of, hey, they seem like a decent person, and then they go to Washington and they become corrupt or whatever. Well, if you're an arbitrator and you're an independent contractor, and the more cases you arbitrate, the more money you make, and the securities industry is involved in picking the arbiters, whatever, you're going to tend to find yourself in favor of the securities industry. Not always, but there's a huge conflict. Here's the other problem, just under the rules of FINRA, is in 2024, 37 cents of every dollar awarded to investors in FINRA arbitration went unpaid, and roughly 1 in 4 awards was never collected. Between 2020 and 2024, about $80 million in arbitration awards went unpaid. So these people did everything right. They followed the rules, brought their claims, and won, but they never received their money. And so this congressman is looking at urging lawmakers to consider rolling FINRA into the SEC or having the brokerage firms create some independent fund to compensate investors when arbitration awards go unpaid or so forth. And maybe if that were to happen, that would encourage them to supervise a little bit more closely if the brokerage firm may be on the hook or having to contribute to that organization. It's an interesting business. Like anything, there's a lot of fine print. And if you do proper investing, you really shouldn't need to engage in arbitration. But it's the things that we don't even believe in that tend to cause problems. Stock picking, churning a portfolio, all of those kinds of things. And all of that increases commissions, increases the likelihood that maybe an investor loses money or doesn't know what's going on. And so, we do want to make sure we have regulation in the industry, but I think it would behoove the industry to have the SEC take over that function. The SEC is who regulates us. we're actually, we're not regulated by FINRA because as fiduciaries, we fall under a different set of law.
Hey, this is Paul Winkler. Hope you enjoyed today's edition of the Investor Coaching Show. If you want to learn more about what we do, go to our website, paulwinkler.com. Until next time, I'm Paul Winkler, reminding you that I believe that more educated investors are more confident investors, and confident investors are more successful investors. Have a great one. Advisory services offered through Paul Winkler, Inc., an SEC-registered investment advisor. The opinions voiced and information provided in this material are for general informational purposes only and not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine what investments are appropriate for you, please consult with a financial advisor. Paul Winkler, Inc. does not provide tax or legal advice. Please consult your tax or legal advisor regarding your particular situation.